Well, President Trump has really tried to kickstart here an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine that's been lingering on for several years now. And joining me now to discuss, CBN's George Thomas and Stephen Weber, who is former CBN director for Ukraine and Russia, lived in Ukraine for 30 years, knows both sides of this very, very well. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here, Dan.
Good to be
here. George, start with you here. So President Trump, let's just get your reaction to this. He has said he wants this thing to be over.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of angst in America, people tiring of funding this, even if they disagree with what Russia's been doing. They're tired. They don't want American dollars going towards this. So you've got that kind of conflict going on that Trump's wrestling with. But Trump generally not a fan of war in a lot of his rhetoric over the years. So what's your reaction to how this is all going to go and what he's trying to do here?
Well, what he's trying to do here, Dan, is bring an end to Europe's largest conflict on European soil since 1945. And this, just in a couple of days, will be the anniversary, the third year anniversary of when Russia launched its invasion into Ukraine. He is trying to, in essence, make a deal with Vladimir Putin of Russia. Remember, 3 years ago, it was the former president, Joe Biden, who called Russia's Vladimir Putin a crazy SOB, the same person that he labeled Putin as a killer. 3 years later, we are on the verge of, in essence, bringing Vladimir Putin out from the cold and, in essence, reestablishing U.S.-Russia relations like we haven't seen since the last 3 years. Keep in mind, the previous administration put on ice the relationship with Vladimir Putin when Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. What Donald Trump is attempting to do here is, number one, reestablish the whole gamut of U.S.-Russia relations, and that's what Marco Rubio is meeting with Lankov in Saudi Arabia today in the next couple of days. And then secondly, to talk about bringing an end to the Ukraine war. Keep in mind, this is a campaign promise that he was constantly talking about, that he would, within the first 24 hours of being in office, taking office, that he would bring an end to the war. Obviously, that hasn't happened. But I think the calculus is that he wants to accomplish this at least within the first 100 days, in essence, fulfilling this foreign policy mandate and promise that he made during the campaign.
All right. And Stephen, this thing's been at a stalemate, and obviously it's going to trigger a lot of things here. You obviously know both sides of this very well, and already even the Biden administration quietly admitted this, and Trump's administration officials have sort of said it out loud that essentially Ukraine's going to have to make some land concessions here if his sort of idea of how this is going to unfold would go. What do you see with this as far as how that's going to go over, land concessions, and then on Putin's side of the thing, what is Russia conceding to? How do you see all this playing out?
Well, it's a complicated situation, yeah, for sure. And, I think that if I was to be on the negotiating table or on the briefing table, I would first have to bring up one very critical point of view, and that is that let's just say Russia, the Tsars of Russia, and then the Soviet Union, they have never in their history had a Magna Carta. They are more Asian in their understanding, the shame and hero base. And so when you're dealing with Vladimir Putin, at the beginning of the war, it was, we have intelligence, they're going to attack. And then Putin would say, no, we're just having exercises. And then that just went on and on and on. And then they invaded. And in the West, we would say, but you said you weren't going to. You lied. And we talk about that because that has value in our culture. But in the Russian culture, this is so important in negotiating, is that no Russian had a problem with that, because lying was important for the end goal. And so first of all, that would be the thing that we have to be so careful with, is even an agreement. We think that we would have an agreement of borders or an agreement of ceasefire, but we have to go back in the history. This is deep in their culture, and they have more shame. If the West could shame Putin, that would be very powerful. But if you give him more power, you lose your influence. And I think, that would probably be my, major thing, is that we can negotiate this, but we might lose, because we would say, well, we've got an agreement. But in the Asian cultures, the shame-based cultures, they don't look at that.
Stephen, what do you think, just real quick to add to that, what do you think would be, is there an obvious thing a tactic that the U.S. could push on that would shame Putin at this point? Is there an obvious one, or is it one that's kind of hidden to everybody at this point?
Well, George, I actually sent to George a briefing that I did, and thinking of Trump's promise in the campaign to end the war in 24 hours, I started to think, what could be the way to end the war quickly? And I do have several ideas, and one of them, there are a few things that are much more important to Vladimir Putin than Ukraine. And you say, well, what could that be? Well, there is, Russia right now has a permanent membership in the Security Council on the UN. That is very important to Russia and to President Putin. And if I was to be on the negotiating table, I would say we need to introduce legislation, or maybe not legislation yet, because we can't do that, but we would get a working group on what the UN says and defines aggressor nation. Who is an aggressor? And then once that's established, then you could establish different drafts of laws that saying that no aggressor nation can be on the permanent Security Council. Those are shame things that would absolutely turn Putin around. Anyway, that's just one idea.
Yeah, no, I like it. George, your reaction?
Well, I was going to say, this whole idea of the White House reaching out to Putin after the International Criminal Court had an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for alleged crimes, war crimes committed in Ukraine. Let's not forget, this was an event that was orchestrated by Russia 3 years ago. Russia clearly has been the aggressor. The Ukrainians have, for the last 3 years, in essence, put up a fight to defend the territorial integrity of their country. Imagine all of just the last 3 years, the political controversy and the back and forth between Ukraine and the United States about this whole idea: can Ukraine possess weapons that would launch offensive military action against Russia? Keep in mind, they were just trying to defend themselves. And they were asking the global community, please, please, we need to be not only able to protect ourselves, but we need to be able to launch offensive counter operations inside Russian territory. And so the fact that today we are on the verge of seeing Vladimir Putin and President Trump shaking hands after what has unfolded in Europe, the largest military conflict since 1945, displacing millions of people, the untold human suffering. 20% of the country now in control of Russian authorities down in the Donbass region, in Mariupol, all along the eastern part of the country. I mean, it's incredible, the sort of seismic change that has unfolded. And then on top of this, we are seeing, guys, a tectonic political shift today in Europe, where in essence, Donald Trump has said to the Europeans, shape up or the Americans are shipping out. That's the quote from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal today. Obviously, Europeans had the sense that there was trouble brewing with the new second-term administration, but they got the shock of their life this past week at NATO headquarters and during the Munich Security Council meeting, where Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, in essence, shot a fire across the bow of Europe, saying that the United States no longer, their focus is no longer on Europe, but we are pivoting to Asia, which kind of makes sense. And what Trump and Hegseth said was, listen, Europe, step up to the plate. Right. Let's have a shared labor of cost in managing this crisis. And so from a political and economic standpoint, it makes total sense to a majority, a good chunk of Americans who will say, listen, Europe, you guys are major economies in the world. Step up to the plate. Increase your defense spending from 1%. Trump wants it up to 5%. So now you have Macron, who is meeting today in Paris, inviting the leaders of the Netherlands, Denmark, the UK, Italy, Spain. They're scrambling because they didn't realize just how deadly serious Trump is on this matter of the Europeans stepping up to the plate and fixing the problem in Ukraine, that it is no longer America's responsibility, and we cannot shoulder the economic or the military cost of doing this. And it's so interesting. He basically is telling to the Europeans, hey, you know what? We don't need you at the negotiating table when I and Vladimir Putin talk. Yeah. In fact, even Ukraine is not part of that negotiation, at least initial negotiations taking place today in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that's interesting, George, because from the financial part of it, I mean, the way Trump's looking at it is we're putting in way more than our fair share of it. I don't know the exact number. I think it's like 20% or something of total NATO, which is it's the largest share, whatever the exact number is. And so he's using that logic to say, well, if you're not going to sit here and pay for all of this, well, then why do you get an equal seat at the table then? We're the ones paying for all of this, so we're going to do it. So you can see the logic there. But guys, Stephen, I'll go to you. I mean, the land issue, I mean, I think a lot of people don't understand this of what's going on exactly and what that means. The Biden administration kind of quietly said this, that, yeah, they're probably going to have to give up some land in all of this. But then the Trump administration has been saying this out loud. What does this mean to the whole region there, to the people of Ukraine, to Vladimir Putin? Why is that land so important? Crimea, and then the other snippets that they've been annexing and trying to annex. What is the goal there?
Yeah, well, I'll have to say that the land is a very important aspect. It is pivotal in my mind, and the West. I'd say Europe and the United States, we understand private property. And we understand right now, and I have friends who have lost their homes, or, people who had churches in the occupied areas that are completely, blown to smithereens. And see, my question is on the land, it's not about the government of the land. That really is immaterial. It is about the private property in the lands. And, one of my other briefing points was that any negotiation needs to start with private property for individuals. If we had that as the flagship conversation, And I have friends who have spent their life, working to get property or to build a church. And now an aggressor nation comes in and just occupies that. Who is going to compensate them? And so my suggestion in the brief is that there's $300 billion of Russian government assets, and put a program together of compensating anyone who has had their property stolen or destroyed, and let that be the first part. You could also say,
Can I just ask you a quick question on that, Stephen?
Yeah.
Are they in limbo now on that? Are they getting like no word on where you're through no fault of your own, you're just caught up in the midst of this you evacuated, or maybe you were there and your house is blown up. Are they hearing anything on resolution for that, or is it just sort of in limbo at this point?
Number one, I've never heard any politician even talk about that. But that's where the aggressor, that's the thing that he has taken away, he has stolen by his aggression. And there's a registrar in Kiev that every single property has a title, it has a name on it, and so this is all available information. But we want to solve the war, but we don't want to solve the problem of private property. And it is true that there are, when they took Crimea, back in 2014, there were many times where all of a sudden there would be, in the next 30 days, every single piece of property needs to be re-registered. And if you don't come and re-register, we're going to confiscate it. That's the kind of communication that needs to start on this world stage, of saying, how are we going to compensate the stealing and the loss of private property? And and I think that this is, to me, it's one of the key things that would put it all into perspective. And also for Europe does feel the threat of war more than the United States of America. And NATO is this is my own opinion, NATO is in a very weak situation right now. And the reason is because the Baltics, those countries are so small. If there was a push from Vladimir Putin to, let's just take Estonia, they could do it probably in 8 hours, completely occupy that country. Washington, D.C. would wake up and they would say, oh no, what should we do? Are we going to activate all of the NATO forces to protect a small country, a few million people? And the question is, probably not. And so those are the questions that are coming up right now, of how strong is NATO? And Zelensky coming up with the idea of having a European army, not NATO, and who knows the underpinnings of what's going on right now. And maybe, like we've already mentioned, Trump is tired of fighting other people's battles, or financing other people's battles, and thinking, well, let them fight. And this security meeting in Munich, I think it's a very illustrative result. And it the one speaker ended up in tears of saying, I've realized today that our values are not the same. European values and U.S. values are not the same, and that needs to be a discussion.
Yeah,
I was going to say, on the issue of why this is so important to the Russians. Keep in mind, and I'm sure Steve can elaborate because he's lived in the region for 40 plus years, is fluent in Ukrainian and in Russian. But one thing you need to understand is this. I think it was Vladimir Putin who said several years ago that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Here is this former KGB guy who was bemoaning the fact that with the help of the United States, principally Ronald Reagan, he saw this empire in essence broken up into so many pieces, and Putin was lamenting that this was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. From a territorial standpoint, deep within Putin mindset and the Russian psyche, not all of them, but a good vast majority of the Russian psyche, is this mentality that Ukraine, as well as the other countries of the former Soviet Union, that we need to get it back. And Ukraine was part of that equation. From a materialistic standpoint, you have to realize that today Ukraine is sitting on one of Europe's largest deposits of critical minerals like lithium and titanium. And in fact, I think there's the estimates are that they're sitting on close to about 13 to 15 trillion dollars of mineral wealth. And that's what Trump has talked about last week. He said, listen, as payback, the United States would like 50% control of your mineral rights as a way to pay back for all the money that we have sent you in the last 3 years. Keep in mind, in the 20% area that the Russians control today in the eastern part of Ukraine, they are sitting on trillions of dollars worth of minerals that have been untapped and unmined. So keep that also in the context of what we see in the negotiations unfolding. Trump wants access to that as part of a payback mechanism for the war the last 3 years. Putin is looking at it from much bigger, grander aspirational visions here. The other question is, and I want to throw this to Steve, can whatever negotiation or whatever commitment to a ceasefire takes place, can the Russians be trusted to maintain their word on whatever signature Vladimir Putin puts his pen to on a piece of paper?
Well, I think that is the $1 million question, and it is speculation. I think that if I would just say that somehow Putin has to come home with honor. And I go back to that very place when we were probably the closest ever to a nuclear war, when Khrushchev and Kennedy, most of his counselors, Kennedy's counselors and security advisors basically said, take the ships out that are coming into Cuba. John F. Kennedy did not do that, but he gave an ultimatum. He said, turn those ships around, and if you do, we will remove our nuclear warheads out of Turkey. So Khrushchev turned around and came back with honor. We accomplished what we needed. And so Putin has to come back with something, for his honor. But to trust them, you see, we have the Reformation, we have the rule of law, and we have court systems that will, we might not get what we want, but we can try people in the highest court of law, the law, with evidence. They do not have that in Russia, and they won't. And so many aspects, this is a clash. In fact, some friends of mine have written books about the true nature of this war, and this is not about territory, and this is not about ethnicity, and these are the premises of the war. But they say this is a war of civilizations. Ukraine has been under the influence and oppression of Russia for centuries, and it is a clash at a level that the fight inside the Ukraine soul or heart is so deep because this is like their Revolutionary War. It's give me liberty or give me death. And they will not stop. You know, I mean, death is better than being under Russia. And I think that we see that in the Ukrainian heart. You know, in my 40 years of experiences and friendships and with people, you know, in both sides, Russia and Ukraine, whenever I would bring up the Golodomor, and the Golodomor was what we call the forced starvation when Stalin collectivized the Ukrainian farms. This happened in the 30s, and it could be, you know, 5 million, 10 million people perished in that. The propaganda and the belief of the Russians to this very day is that it was bad harvest. But the Ukrainians to this day know it was completely different. And the Ukrainians have personal histories. I mean, it was either their grandmother or their grandfather survived the forced starvation because they had corn husks in the roof, in their thatched roofs, and they were eating 3 or 4 kernels of corn a day, and they survived. But this is the war today is exactly, I mean, the emotions, when I would bring that up, the Russians would feel this, it was like it happened yesterday. You guys are full of lies. And the Ukrainians would say, you guys are full of propaganda. And there could be no more conversation. And these could be within believers. Well, Russian believers and Ukrainian believers, it's like they have two different views of history. And this is a continuation of that. And it's like, we will die not to be under the influence of Russian propaganda and totalitarian authority. And so it's not going to go away. A piece of paper is just an appeasement.
Do you guys think, I mean, you're talking about grander plans, George, and you're talking about these old wounds and the way of the soul and the battle for it. Is Putin's kind of main aim here a full reunification? Like, given what you were talking about and how that they view that as a big, you know, that one of the biggest tragedies was the fall of the Soviet Union. Is that his goal here? And if so, is Trump aware of this? And what is he going to try to do to put any pressure on Putin to not go further, like you were saying, once they sign that piece of paper?
I think from the Kremlin standpoint, he sees since the election of Donald Trump, he has seen a weaker Europe, a weaker NATO, and his stature on the global stage, in essence, has reemerged. And that's all a win. In the parlance of Steve, that's a huge honor for him. You know, keep in mind, this NATO to him was a huge threat right on his border. It's understandable. But we're no longer in the sort of Soviet era, you know, the Red Army influence, you know, around the world. So NATO was created primarily to be a beachhead, to be a force that would stop any kind of aggression by the former Soviet Union. What we saw 3 years ago was that Europe and the United States that really didn't answer to Russia when it annexed Crimea in 2014, when the war started back then in 2014. And so in the Kremlin's perspective, they are winning, even though the Ukrainians have put up an incredible fight the last 3 years to stave off this philosophy, this mentality that Russia should be reconstituted, that its former Soviet satellites should be reconstituted. I think what happens now, as Europe tries to figure out how they're going to protect themselves, how they're going to protect the continent, I think definitely Putin is feeling so emboldened like he hasn't in the last 3 years. As Steve mentioned, you know, I was in Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia 2 years ago. Last year, I was in Moldova. In my opinion, Moldova is low-hanging fruit for the Russians. Forget about 8, 9, 10 days. They can take Moldova like this. It's easy pickings for the Russians. This definitely emboldens Vladimir Putin, and what this administration, the White House, is doing is to embolden Putin like never before. And to have direct contact and relations with Vladimir Putin brings tremendous honor to the Kremlin. But you can also understand the other side, because a good chunk of the American public, they are fed up. We can understand that. I mean, our economy is hemorrhaging. We're dealing with high inflation. Cost of living is going up. Everything is going up. And they're like, why are we involved in a country and in a part of the world where there are other countries that can easily step up? So I can understand both sides. But we also need to take a long-term perspective. Keep in mind, Vladimir Putin, like Xi Jinping of China, like Kim Jong-il of North Korea, these guys are not on a 4-year cycle. They're not on a 4-year cycle. They're
lifetime. They just keep going.
There's a reason why they're called a dictator. Yeah. They're in for life. They are in for life. So Putin can hold out for the next 4 years, like he did under the previous administration. And guess what? In a heartbeat, his whole stature on the world stage has changed within 4 years. And so these guys can hang out. They can hang out for as long as it takes, with this mentality, with this mindset that we have a long view of history, just like the Chinese. They have a long view of history. They don't look at it in 4-year increments. They look at it in a long-term perspective. And these countries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea have these grand schemes that will maybe take 50, 60, 70 years, but they're going to hold on tight.
A quick thought, guys, because I've seen this floated around. Giving the concessions, giving them, like you said, emboldens Putin. But when we look at, just like the timing of it all, when we look at the 2014, revolution that we talked about there, that was under the Obama administration. Then you had the Trump administration come in, and then it was kind of quiet. And then it wasn't until the Biden administration that we saw the aggression from Putin into Ukraine again. So is that happenstance in the long arc that you're talking about there, or was Trump deterring them in some way? Like, maybe he's just crazy enough that he'd do something to retaliate, whereas more standard presidents wouldn't. I bring that up to say, because while he may be emboldened, is there anything there from the recent past about Trump that might make him think twice? Either you're fine. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, Putin does want to reestablish the Soviet Union in some way. It's not easy, in some way. But that empire thinking is a existential threat to Europe. I mean, who knows Romania? Who knows Bulgaria? Poland probably understands it better than anyone, because they are so resistant to any overtures of battle. But Putin, I would say, is the bully. And he does have empire thinking. And we cannot go to the table without knowing that and realizing that. Russia is not an empire without Ukraine. Russia knows the food, the grain that Ukraine can produce, and that is a huge leverage in the world for world hunger and world feeding the world. And so the only language that Vladimir Putin understands is force. And that's how someone in the U.S. administration needs to understand that. I had a very interesting interview with General Clark. He was the NATO commander force for a number of years. And in 2014, in my interview with him, he just made almost like a prophetic declaration. He said, Ukraine must remain independent. Otherwise, we will have war in Europe. And that was, and so I really don't, I mean, our administrations here have been, strong and then weak, strong and weak. And we have different philosophies, I mean, under the Biden, and I have to, I guess I can mention this because I was in Ukraine when, 30 or 40 senators send a letter, to Poroshenko and tell him, you need to support the gay pride parades and all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, that has been our foreign policy. And, foreign policy, as Kissinger said, it's just a list of priorities. And if that is number one on our foreign policy priority, it is mixed up. And Putin uses this to support this special military operation in Ukraine. It says, we are protecting the Ukrainians from the decadent West. The Holy Russian Church is going to save the world. And look what they're doing in the West. And so these are, like you said, on the high level, these are global thinking. This is empire thinking. I mean, when Putin brings the Pope, to Moscow, and I mean, the split in the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. I mean, we're talking, centuries. There is Byzantine empire thinking, and we can't go in this blind.
I was going to say also, this, and I think I'd like to ask Steve, and Dan, you can echo this, because we have seen, and in my opinion, it's a little concerning. We have seen in recent past, probably the last 7 to 10 years, within the American fabric, this idea that Russia and Vladimir Putin are a good thing. The sense that what Vladimir Putin is fighting against, to Steve's point, this immorality, gay marriage, abortion, that the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin's mentality, cracking down on homosexuality in Russia, cracking down on abortion, trying to strengthen the family institution in Russia, and he has harpooned the sort of Western morale, the moral decadence that's coming out of the West, and has been this as the sort of champion of religious freedom and Christian values and so forth. There is a strain within the American public and within politicians that look at Vladimir Putin as somebody who is to be admired. And that what he is doing in Ukraine, he is in essence protecting religious freedom. There was all of this talk about how Russia was not violating human rights and persecuting people, those who are believers in the occupied territories. There was this narrative, whether it's Tucker Carlson or others, who propagate this idea that Russia is good and everything that they stand for and believe and their ideology and their philosophy is good, and that Vladimir Putin is good. Steve, where is this coming from?
Well, I mean, I guess we have to look at the foundation of this, and it's sort of like, if those values were really the motivating values, then what would we use? We would use persuasion. We would use discussion. As soon as you go over into force, you have undermined the very thing that you want. It's like, we're going to force Christian values on you, and if you don't agree, we're going to come over and take you. I mean, can you imagine, can you imagine the Ukrainians right now who have suffered, just tremendous loss of life. I mean, the things that we know deeply that happened in, Irpin and Bucha, they were right, and these were in the first weeks of the war, and they were ready to occupy. And the things that happened in those areas, because they didn't have time to cover up the war atrocities, we know what happened. And it was, absolutely terrible. And now you're thinking, okay, we couldn't persuade you to come under the covering of Russia with diplomacy, with discussion, with generosity, and let's have the Ukrainian-Russian brotherhood. We can't do it that way, so we came in and tried to force it. And then the goal is, well, because you need to be a part of us. We're going to do all these things, and then you're going to want to join us. And it's like you are on a different planet. And so, yeah, it's Christian values on a political scale that have absolutely no reality in actions. The Ukrainians see through it.
Very interesting stuff. Gentlemen, I appreciate you breaking this all down. I mean, we should talk again about this as it develops. I'm sure more things will happen over the coming weeks, but really, really good insight there. Very much appreciated. CBN's George Thomas and Stephen Weber, former CBN director for Ukraine and Russia. Gentlemen, appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.